Misinformation regarding the COVID-19 vaccines. My name is Haley Shalansky, and I'm a peer educator for the Office of Wellness Promotion. Before we get started, I have a few general items to review. Today's presentation is in webinar format. All participants will remain on mute throughout the presentation. We will be recording this session in order to make sure it is available for folks who are unable to join us today. If you have a question for our speaker, please ask it in the Q&A. Questions will be addressed towards the later part of the presentation. If you have a question for a member of our team that is not focused on the presentation but may be more of a logistical question, please send a chat to either Sarah Williamson or Jamie Trogus, who can help navigate your question directly with you. Today, we are excited to welcome to WCU Dr. Kishana Taylor to provide information as we all continue to navigate through the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Dr. Kishana Taylor is a virologist, president, and co-founder of the Black Microbiologists Association and advocate for minoritized groups in STEM. Dr. Taylor received her bachelor's degree in animal science from the University of Delaware, where she was named a Woman of Promise, in addition to being the EPSCoR and Summer Institute Research Scholar. Dr. Taylor continued her education at the George Washington University, earning a master's degree in public health microbiology and emerging infectious disease. Dr. Taylor went on to earn a PhD from the University of Georgia in interdisciplinary biomedical studies in 2018. Her research focused on developing laboratory animal models of virus transmission in epizootic hemorrhagic disease virus. Dr. Taylor is currently a postdoctoral fellow at Carnegie Mellon University in the lab of Dr. Elizabeth Wayne. Her current NSFH funded research focuses on the role of monocytes and macrophages in SARS-CoV-2 infection and subsequent development of COVID-19. Dr. Taylor's research into Dr. Taylor's research interests include arboviruses, zoonotic viruses, and their epidemiology, ecology, and evolution. Welcome, Dr. Taylor. You're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you for that introduction. You did a great job. Hi, everyone, and thank you for having me today. So like everyone has said already, I am going to talk to you a little bit today about coronavirus, the coronavirus or COVID-19 vaccines, and then how you can learn to sift information. So learning what's good for information or where to get good information from in comparison to bad information. And so I like to start all of my COVID-19 presentations with what I call a position statement. So the introduction did a really great job, basically in saying that I am a virologist who's interested in emerging viruses that can be transferred from animals to people. And so that's what a zoonotic virus is. And then I'm also interested in viruses that are spread from mosquitoes to animals and to people. And so that's what arboviruses or vector-borne viruses are. And so I'm also the president of the Black Microbiologists Association. And I spend a lot of my time now either doing virology work in the lab or doing seminars like this where I'm doing outreach with the community or with the academic community in terms of helping people to understand what's going on with the coronavirus vaccine and coronavirus research and what's going on overall with the epidemiology of COVID, and then how we can be better at filtering ourselves through information. And so I know I have you for an hour today. I have about 25 minutes worth of information that I'd like to get through. And then hopefully, if you don't already have questions, these will spark some questions, and then we can kind of have a really good question and answer period throughout the rest of the presentation. So basically what I'm going to talk to you today about is what is coronavirus, what is SARS-CoV-2, what are vaccine production and vaccines typically like, and then what makes the specific SARS-CoV-2 vaccines different. What is an EUA? That abbreviation has been thrown around a lot in the last couple of months. How to find valid sources of information, lessons from COVID, and then I will talk a little bit at the very end after all your questions have been answered about the Black Microbiologists Association in case any of you are interested in joining that community. So I will get started now. So SARS-CoV-2 or severe acute respiratory syndrome, coronavirus 2 is a coronavirus very similar to some other epidemic or pandemic coronaviruses that we've seen, including the original SARS, which came in 2003, and then MERS, which came in like 2015, 2016. And then it's also related to the common cold viruses. So there are a couple of common cold viruses that are also coronaviruses, specifically human coronavirus 229E, and some others that we get infected with on a regular basis every couple of years or so. And so we, as a population of people, of humans, have been exposed to multiple coronaviruses over time. But this coronavirus has been particularly unique because while the first cases were found in China in like December, it basically spread globally, right, with the first cases in the US coming in January 2020. It was declared a pandemic virus by March 20th, and we are still in the pandemic today. And so some of the repercussions of this pandemic that we've seen is that within the US particularly, we have 32.5 million cases of SARS-CoV-2 so far, and 577,000 plus deaths. And that number grows every day. And then if we look at the global cases, we have 1.5 million cases globally, and then 3.2 million deaths. And so specifically within the US, we have taken on a large amount of both the cases and the deaths. And so we have been really invested in developing a vaccine so that we can then start to mitigate, in addition to wearing masks and washing hands and all those things that we've been doing for the past year, to help end the pandemic and start to get back to what we would like to think is a normal life. And so some of the common questions I get about the SARS coronavirus vaccine is kind of like, why is this different? And so I always like to start out with a primer that talks about specifically vaccines in general, and then can jump into how the COVID-19 vaccines are different. And so the first question is, what is a vaccine, right? And so a vaccine is a substance used to stimulate the production of antibodies and T cells and provide immunity against one or several diseases prepared from the causative agent of disease, its products, or a synthetic substitute treated to act as an antigen without inducing the disease. And so basically what that means is that a vaccine usually has either the actual pathogen, a piece of the pathogen, or something to mimic the pathogen in it that then induces your body to have an immune response. And so typically when we think about how vaccines are made prior to this pandemic, we usually had some version of a attenuated virus. So that means a attenuated virus or pathogen. So a pathogen that is living, but has reduced ability to cause disease within us, a dead pathogen. So it's completely killed and therefore it cannot infect you, or some portion of that pathogen. So we call these usually subunit vaccines. So in the case of like a bacteria, you might pull off like a pili or some other like surface protein, and then use that to then create an immune response. And then oftentimes you might have to use, or sometimes you have to use an adjuvant. And so a common component in an adjuvant is aluminum or some other natural compound. And what that does is it just intensifies your body's response to whatever is inside that vaccine. And so basically it just ensures that your body is mounting a good enough response that when you are then exposed to the pathogen, that you can fight it off. And so vaccination is different from a lot of different treatments that we think of, because you usually are vaccinating healthy people who have not been exposed to the disease that you're trying to treat for or prevent. And it's usually different than a treatment, right? Because you're actually then like using some piece of the pathogen to then confer immunity, versus when you get treatment for, like a strep throat infection, you get antibiotics. It's something that kills the pathogen. You're not introducing any piece of the pathogen into your body. And so that's kind of the basic rundown of the different types of vaccines that we've had prior to this pandemic. What has been really interesting or really cool to see is the development of these new, not new in theory, but new in actually being able to facilitate production vaccines. And so two out of the three vaccines that we currently have, so the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccines, are mRNA vaccines. And then the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a vectored vaccine. And so what a vectored vaccine means essentially is that you have another virus that has been basically gutted. And so you take out any of the proteins or RNA or DNA structure that would allow that virus to replicate. And then you add the specific protein for SARS-CoV-2 to that gutted virus. And then that's what people are being injected with. And so while the virus is alive and will elicit some type of immune response from the body, you won't be able to have that virus replicate. And so there's no way for you to continually have an infection typically. And so when we have like biosafety controls and all that kind of stuff, they make sure that you don't then have like some slip ups, which is a possibility. And so with the mRNA vaccines, those are different because we are taking a component of the virus that is not usually used. And so if anyone is familiar with RNA or mRNA, mRNA is usually after DNA or RNA has been translated. And so it's basically messenger RNA. And this is what's sent to a different part of your cell to then create proteins. And so what the mRNA vaccines are doing is it's taking specifically the code that codes for the spike protein for the coronavirus, which is how the virus gets into your cells. And then it basically has your body make the protein. And so I've drawn up a pretty good schematic for this. And so if we think about regular viral infection, you would have a coronavirus that would then take its spike proteins and attach itself to a receptor on your cell. And so once the coronavirus gets into your cell, it starts to replicate and produce mRNA. And so the mRNA is then sent over here to your ribosomes, and your ribosomes then synthesize new proteins based off of the mRNA that it's sent there. And so once all of the viral proteins are synthesized, it then will package all of those new proteins together, and then you get an output of new viruses. And so essentially we've kind of hacked how viruses replicate. And instead we've taken mRNA enclosed inside what we call nanoparticles. And so basically this is just to protect the mRNA until it gets inside of the cell. The nanoparticle fuses with your cell and it releases the mRNA. And so that mRNA can travel directly right to those ribosomes as if it was being produced in replication. And then because it's only the mRNA for the spike protein, you have spike proteins that are either released from the cell or displayed on the outside of the cell and presented to your different immune cells. And so you'll have an infected cell. So a cell that has that mRNA and has produced that spike protein, and then it can present it to T cells and B cells, and you'll have the production of antibodies and other immune cells that will then be able to fight off the infection should you be exposed to SARS-CoV-2 at some other point. And so that's kind of what's different about the COVID vaccines now. And so some of the other questions that we get now that we've kind of explained what the vaccines are is how are they made so quickly and are they safe? And so while to someone who has not been involved in the process or someone who doesn't understand the vaccine process, we would think that it happened within the course of a year. But because we have been exposed to things like MERS and SARS before, there were researchers who were working on kind of like a plug and chug type vaccine where you have all of the components already made, and then you can just take the different RNA structures for a different coronavirus and plug it in. And so those already pre-existed. And then once we were able to sequence the virus, so we got sequences for SARS-CoV-2 in like February, early March. And so once you get the sequences that you need, it's really pretty easy to then plug in the mRNA sequence that you need in order to move forward. And so in addition to that, if we look at this chart, this kind of goes over like in general what the vaccine process looks like. And so you start off with identifying the different antigens or the different components of a pathogen that you want to use to then confer immunity, and then you have to mass produce them. And then you start to use whatever components within your vaccine in what we call preclinical testing to make sure that, right, that you're going to get some type of response. And then you do it in animals, both originally for safety and then for efficacy. And then you start to test it in humans. And so that's when you have like the phase 3 trial, which is when you're basically recruiting people to your clinical study who are then followed over a course of time. And so once you have enough data within a phase 3 trial, that's when you usually file for approval with the FDA. And so what has been really great or unique, again, with this particular pandemic, is that we were able to use a process called emergency use authorization, also called an EUA. And so basically an emergency use authorization authorizes unapproved medical products to be used in an emergency to diagnose, treat, or prevent serious life-threatening illnesses. You can only get an EUA when you've started phase 3 human trials, and you have to include all of the safety data from phases 1 and 2. And so at the point in which you submit your like files for approval, you have to have at least half the study participants ready for a 2-month follow-up for after you submit your paperwork. And you have to have an active plan for continued follow-up over time. And so essentially that paperwork is then sent to a 13-member board who reviews the files and then kind of gives like a yes or a no vote in terms of whether or not they think that this vaccine is warranted for the use of an EUA. And then they give their suggestions to the FDA board and they make the final decision. And so an EUA is different from filing for full approval by the FDA because you have less time. And so with all of the SARS-CoV-2 or the COVID-19 vaccines, they've all had to use an EUA because they were only created within the last year. And so they don't have enough phase 3 clinical trials. The earliest that phase 3 trial started was in August of 2020. They don't have enough data. It's typically a 2-year process. They usually want to see 2 years of data. And so they did not have enough, we didn't have enough time to do that. And so they got the EUA. My understanding is that you can apply early for actual like full approval, but it really just depends on like what the data looks like. And so what the FDA wants to be able to see is like the duration of immunity that is conferred by the vaccine, whether or not it not only stops disease, but also stops infection or spread of the pathogen, and then whether or not there are some longer adverse effects in terms of vaccination. And so actually, Moderna and Pfizer are both going ahead and filing for full approval at the end of May, even though we haven't reached that 2-year period, I guess because they're confident in that data. But so far, we haven't really seen any major concerning things with either the Pfizer or Moderna. And with J&J, we had that pause a couple of weeks ago because there were maybe, I think when they finished was roughly about 20 cases of blood clots after being infected or after being injected with the vaccine. And so they followed the right protocols there, and they stopped using it until they could do some more information. And so they found out that it's still a really rare event. And so they put an extra warning on those vaccinations and then proceeded to be able to vaccinate folks. And so that kind of helps to answer the question. I know some folks are concerned that it hasn't been full approval. It's not that it's because the vaccine is unsafe or that it doesn't work. It's just that they don't have the long enough time frame for that data. Some other reasons why the COVID vaccines have been produced so quickly is that because it was a pandemic, you had financial investment from every nation in the world, which is really helpful because oftentimes the issue with funding with vaccine development is that you don't have the funding because it's not an important pathogen to everyone. But obviously, due to the high toll of death and the high morbidity, everyone was invested in getting this vaccine done. So there was lots of money put into it. And then on top of that, when you recruit people for phase 3 trials, you then have to wait until they are exposed and then potentially develop disease. Well, since it's a new disease and it's spreading so rapidly, it's very easy to get to those endpoints. And so those are the types of things that basically sped up the process of even getting to the point of an EUA. And so I always like to add in that little bit of information so that we can understand that in this case, the speed in which that we have been able to create these vaccines is actually really great science. And the process is working the way that it's supposed to in terms of government approval and understanding how things work. And so I kind of want to lead into that now, into like how to validate information, because I'm sure either you or your family members or friends or people you know have kind of run into this. Well, there's a lot of information and I don't know what's right and what isn't right. And so I like to use this really great example of like a meme. And so I know my generation, so I'm a millennial, and then the Generation Z that comes after me, we spend a lot of time on the internet. And also now our parents are starting to spend more time on the internet, and they have Facebook and Twitter and all those kinds of things. And so we'll see memes like this kind of floating around on the internet. And so, if you aren't really sure how to validate that information, you might take that as a valid source of information. Or, I think a lot of the times we just subliminally take things in. And so the reason why things like memes or YouTube videos or even just the rumor mill are not accurate sources of information is because one, we don't know who's behind them. And so we don't know the motivations behind the information that's being shared. We don't know whether or not people are then like going to try and sell some alternative method and then like make profit off of it that way. We don't know how accurate the science is. And so typically, if you are looking for accurate information, you want to go somewhere where they're going to list their sources. And so those are places like cdc.gov, the American Society for Microbiology's website, the Food and Drug Administration's website, which very nicely lays out and even has a video for what the EUA is and like what the process is, as well as Johns Hopkins has been doing a really good job of kind of chronicling the coronavirus epidemic overall. But so basically, good sources of information are going to provide you where they got the information from. So whether it's from an academic paper or a newspaper or an interview with a doctor, those sorts of things, they're always going to tell you where the source came from. And if you don't see sources, then it's not a dependable piece of information. It could be true, it could not be true. And so when you see something on a meme or on a YouTube video, it's always best to do your own research to then go back and say, well, I don't know if that's accurate. So let me double check and do that checking. And yeah, so the reason why you would then link a scientific article is because that's usually where the data is coming from. And so we've kind of seen this over the last year. Even in news sources, they'll pull from journal articles that have been produced or something called preprints, which are now basically peer reviewed papers that have been submitted to that server. And so if you are pulling information from a source, you want to cite that source so that someone can then go back to that source and say, oh, okay, I see where they got this data from. And it's especially important when things like newspapers are citing preprints because they haven't been validated by other scientists yet. And so it's likely to change a little bit as we go through the process. And so the end result is please don't get all your information from memes, or if you're going to get information from memes, please do your own research to back it up and make sure that it's accurate. And so you can then pass this information on to the people in your life who maybe also kind of follow this train of thought in terms of where they get their information from. And so I really like to summarize what we have learned so far from COVID. In addition to like that vaccinations are important, we've learned, right, that masks are super important. And so when we think about how we are going to come to the end of this pandemic, it doesn't just include vaccination, but it includes continued mask usage for those who are not vaccinated, or even those who are vaccinated. Vaccines are not 100% effective. And so there's always going to be some breakthrough infections and some breakthrough illness, in which case a mask is still going to be protective for you. Washing your hands, we have learned through mask usage and washing your hands that we can even start to get rid of other viral infections that are usually pretty nasty in the wintertime, right? We haven't seen a lot of cases of influenza or even like RSV, respiratory syncytial virus. We've seen much lower incidences of both of those viruses this year because people have been so good about washing their hands, wearing masks, and staying home when they're sick. That's been a big one, not to go home or not to go to work or school if you're feeling ill. we've also learned the importance of local governance. So depending on what state or what county or what town or city you live in, the governance has been different. And so you'll see differences in virus spread depending on what like the local laws are where you are. And then also, I think, especially now that we're seeing increased cases among young folks, is that the assumption of health and wellness. And so basically the whole reason we're even in this pandemic to begin with is that we had lots of asymptomatic case spreading, right? So people who didn't have fever or who weren't sick yet have been able to then like spread the disease to folks who are off guard because these people do not appear sick. And so you never know who might be shedding virus, and that applies to a lot of different viruses, not just SARS-CoV-2. And then also we've kind of seen this shift among young adults where at first it was mostly only old people who were dying. And so it was like, oh, we don't really need to be worried about that because we're younger. But as we see more older adults getting vaccinated and the younger populations are left vulnerable, we're seeing a lot more increased incidence, not only in young adults, but in children and adolescents as well. And so it's really important that we do our best to protect everyone, even those who, especially those who are not able to get vaccinated yet. And so that's where I will end my presentation, and then I can start taking questions.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Hi, everyone. My name is Jamie Trogus. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the director in the Office of Wellness Promotion. I'm so glad to have folks here with us today. There were a couple questions that were submitted ahead of time that we can start with, but encouraging those of you who may have questions to put them in the Q&A, and we can certainly go through them. So the first question, Dr. Taylor, that was sent in ahead of time was that when most of the population has a mistrust in science, do you feel that your opinion on the vaccine is as valued and respected as it should be?
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, one, I like to point out that everyone is entitled to their own opinion. And so when you're talking to experts, it's not necessarily an opinion, more a basis in fact. And so I do like to make that differentiation when people are asking about opinions, because yes, everyone's opinion, everyone has an opinion, and people will value certain people's opinions more than others. But I'm looking specifically at the numbers and at the science, and that is how I communicate it. And so when I make that distinction, I think it's a little bit easier for people to follow along. But I also understand that there is some distrust in science and some distrust in medicine. And so I try to meet people where they're at. I will admit that sometimes it is frustrating, especially with my own personal family, right? When I'm like, I've been in school for forever, and this is what I do, and you're still not listening to me. But I have to remember to meet people where they're at. Not everyone has been in school for as long as I have. Not everyone has this knowledge. And so I do my best to share. Once I'm done being upset, I do my best to share with them the information and try and help them to understand what is happening.
Thank you. And you may have addressed this, I'm going to ask it because it did come in as well, is how do you deal with people from a non-science background trying to explain to you why they do not trust the vaccine?
Right. So I always listen to them, because sometimes people have valid opinions. I think specifically when at the beginning of the conversations around vaccination, there was a lot of hesitancy or questions in some of the minority populations and communities. And I think that they had valid concerns. And I think that in terms of communicating, we have done a really good job of outreach into those populations. And so we have seen hesitancy in those places drop. I try to, along those lines, basically just explain that, I have been doing this research for a really long time. I've been involved in this process for a really long time. And so while I understand your concerns, let me tell you what I know or what I have been involved in. And I think it's easier to have those conversations when you validate their feelings of concern. Now, there are some people who don't fall into those categories who have different concerns, and those might be harder to validate, but you kind of have to do your best. And you also have to accept that there are some people that are just not going to get the message and they're not going to agree with you. And you have to, for the sake of your own sanity, in some cases, just walk away from the conversation and let it go. And just do your best to help the people who actually want the information and who are actually genuinely interested in understanding, so that they can then go protect themselves.
Thank you. So the next question that came in is if you could address some of the concerns that have been raised around fertility with the vaccine. So the person who asked the question said that the hesitancy of young women to be vaccinated because they're worried about some concerns related to fertility.
Yeah, so my understanding of why fertility concerns came up in the first place was that there was a paper that, or there was a doctor or someone who said that the spike protein mimics another protein that is present in the female reproductive system, and I'm pretty sure that's not accurate. But there are different organizations like the American College of Gynecology, associations for reproductive technology, et cetera, who have basically advocated for people to get vaccinated, especially pregnant people, or people who are considering getting pregnant, because you get hit so much harder with COVID when you are pregnant because you're already immune compromised. And so for folks who are concerned about their fertility, I would say that there's no scientific evidence that fertility is an issue. I know people who were both pregnant and are trying to get pregnant who have gotten vaccinated and then have subsequently gotten pregnant afterwards or have had healthy babies afterwards. And there are plenty of studies that are coming out now showing that people who either were breastfeeding or pregnant or trying to get pregnant while being vaccinated have then gone on to basically have regular healthy lives, and there's been no effect other than being able to pass immunity on to your fetus or your infant. And so that's what I would say for that.
Thank you. Next question is recommendations that you would offer to tell somebody if they want to get the vaccine, but they're skeptical about it. So as we think about some of the concerns that people have raised, and especially as we think about return to campus and things along those lines, to encourage students and faculty staff in our community to be vaccinated, recommendations you would have for folks around how to encourage other folks to get the vaccine.
Sure. I think so far the data has shown that the most effective thing is people seeing people they know getting the vaccine and then being okay afterwards, right? And so if your whole family has gotten vaccinated and there's like one holdout, and you in terms of a family member, and you all have a conversation, hey, I got vaccinated 2 months ago and I seem to be fine, or I've gone through the process and everything seems to be okay. That has been really helpful in reducing vaccine hesitancy. And then for those folks who are not swayed by that sort of thing, then I think you can really just have a conversation about what it is that they're skeptical about, and then try to address those specific issues that they bring up. So it's not going to be the same for everybody. And then, right, again, like depending on what their issue is, it might not be something that you can convince them to do, depending on like whether whether like you can use facts or whether they're swayed by different scientific facts and that sort of thing.
Thank you. So the next question that came in is, can you share some information about the mutations of COVID-19 that we're seeing, and if any of the current vaccines are offering protection against those variants?
Yes. So there are a handful of variants that are going on right now. I think the most common one we're seeing in the States is B16. I get a little confused with the numbers if I don't have them right in front of me. But essentially, with the mutations, the more hosts that the virus has, the more it's going to replicate and the more chances you have at mutation. So the reason why viruses, specifically like coronaviruses, RNA viruses, are able to mutate is because they don't have, well, coronaviruses are a little different, but in general, RNA viruses don't have a proofreading mechanism that you have when you think about like DNA replication and how you have like specific proteins that will go back and say, oh, this is wrong, let me correct that. Coronaviruses do have that. It's not as effective, but they have it more so than say like an influenza virus. But basically over time, you'll see these accumulation of mutations. It just means that the virus has had multiple opportunities to replicate. And so far from what we've seen, I think all the vaccines so far have been protective, but I think Pfizer and Moderna have been more effective at being protective. So basically the way that they measure protectiveness is by like what they call an antibody titer. And so they basically take they take your blood and they will dilute it down to a certain amount. So you'll have like a 1 to 10 dilution, a 1 to 100 dilution, et cetera, and you go all the way out. And then so they'll see at what dilution do your antibodies stop neutralizing virus, and then the virus goes on to replicate. And so with the original SARS virus, which is what's been used in all of the mRNA vaccines, the titer is like something ridiculous, like you can go all up to like 1 to 10,000 or something, and you'll still have protection. And then with all the mutation variants, it drops down to like 1 in 500, but that's still considered protective immunity. And so you're still being protected, you just don't have as robust a response to the mutations. And so if we can do a good job of getting everyone vaccinated, or a certain number of the population vaccinated to the point where the virus does not have as many opportunities to replicate, then mutations won't be an issue. But if we continue to have low coverage of vaccination, and continued, use of people who are not using the other mitigation steps, so mask wearing, hand washing, social distancing, et cetera, that gives the virus more opportunities to mutate. And so eventually it is possible that we could have a mutation that is then able to escape a protective immunity, and then we would have to then potentially create like a booster or something like that will then help us have actual immunity to that particular mutant.
Thank you. Next question is, of the two vaccine technologies, the mRNA and the vector, being employed for COVID-19, is there one of them that you believe will eventually prove to be more effective and or safe?
Safe? No, I think that they're both pretty safe. So the vector does in both manufacturers that are doing a vectored vaccine, there does seem to be this like rare blood clotting event that we're not finding in the mRNA vaccines, but overall I think they're still pretty safe, and you can get treated for it if you like know that you've been vaccinated and they catch it. I think I think that mRNA is a little bit easier, because you can modify different parts of the mRNA like through technology that then like makes it a more stable, or like a more stronger reaction. But honestly, I think all of them are really good, and I think all of them are safe. And so whichever vaccine you have access to, you should take.
Thank you. Next question that came in is that the questions asked, I've been hearing that the vaccine alter your genetic material. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, so if we go back to this slide, right? So the reason why I think that people are jumping to the assumption that it alters your genetic material is because you have that mRNA, which is something that humans also produce when they're trying to make proteins. However, because we're not injecting ourselves with any specific viral genes or anything like that, it's literally just the mRNA, which has already been translated. Basically, your body uses up, or your cells use up the mRNA that you're injected with, and then there's nothing else to use. Those proteins are produced, and then they get processed by the immune system, and then that's it. So there's no way for it to interact with your DNA. And I think in terms of viruses even interacting with your DNA in general, when a coronavirus infects your cells, even in a like a natural infection, it's not going into your nucleus, right? And that's where your DNA is. RNA viruses replicate in the cytoplasm, so in like kind of that liquid soup that's inside of your cells, versus something like HPV or even like chickenpox virus, those sorts of things. Those are DNA viruses, so those will actually then insert themselves inside of your genome. And so we have vaccinations for those too, so that we then don't have these like chronic infections of HPV or chickenpox. But even if we weren't using mRNA and we were using the coronavirus viral genome, it does not go into your DNA, your nucleus, I'm losing words. It doesn't go into your nucleus, and so it has no contact with the DNA at all. So that's it's not something that you should be concerned about.
Thank you. Hi, all. My name is Sarah Williamson. I'm the Associate Director in the Office of Wellness Promotion. So I'm going to tag in for Jamie here for a little bit. So going back to the fertility question, have you seen any evidence of the vaccines impacting menstruation with folks with uteruses?
Yes. So it's all anecdotal, right? So basically you have people who have been saying that they have been experiencing heavier periods post either their first or second injection with the different mRNA vaccines. And so there are studies going on now to kind of get an assessment of that. But additional like uterine lining shedding is not the same thing as causing infertility, right? So we shed our lining every month. As people with uteruses, your typically your uterine lining is going to be shed every month. And so we think it's some interaction between like the signals that your body gets to shed that lining, but we're not sure because up until maybe like 2 months ago, no one had really like put the data together. And so we're still coming together to see whether or not that's a thing. But there seems to be like a good amount of anecdotal evidence or data or evidence that that is something that is happening. But it does not affect fertility because you do shed your lining every month anyway. And so you then like build it back up, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you. So our campus is currently virtual for the most part, but is it planning a return in person for operations come the fall? But being a state institution, we can't mandate the vaccine because of a law within Pennsylvania.
Okay.
Do you have recommendations for how our students can keep themselves safe in the fall? Should they still social distance, wear masks, small groups? What recommendations would you have?
Yeah, especially if the students are not planning on getting vaccinated, I absolutely would still recommend that you wear masks and social distance and stay in small groups and those sorts of things. I think if enough students are vaccinated and if enough of the population is vaccinated by the time that school starts, I think you might be able to be a little less cautious. But until we reach 70, I think the estimate is like 75% of the population in order for us to then start to have some sort of like herd immunity. I would recommend at least still mask usage, even if you are vaccinated, especially because we don't know what mutations are going to look like come September. And so that advice might change if we get enough people vaccinated and then there are no more mutations and the virus starts to go away, then throw your mask in the garbage, but we don't know yet. And so I personally will be exercising caution and still distancing and wearing masks, especially for within folks who are not vaccinated. If I am vaccinated, then I can let my guard down a little bit and maybe remove masks and hang out outside and keep it cool or whatever.
Building off of that, can you share a little bit, Dr. Taylor, about while we were building up that kind of reaching for that herd immunity, while we might have some members of our community that are currently vaccinated and others that might be halfway or haven't started yet, what are some of the precautions that we should be utilizing now until we reach that herd immunity status?
Yeah, so the recommendation is that if you are around someone who is not vaccinated, you basically still maintain this, or like not fully vaccinated. So someone who has either gotten the 1 shot for J&J or the 2 shots for Moderna or Pfizer, and then have waited the 2 subsequent weeks after inoculation, you should then basically still maintain the same kind of caution that you have been using the entire time. And I will say if then like, so like, especially if you're a student, right, you're on campus, you're in the dorms with other people who are vaccinated, then you can kind of loosen things up a little bit. For me, and so the recommendation for folks, especially who have little kids who don't have an approved vaccine yet, is still to operate with some caution, right? Because then it's possible that your kids could get infected, or if you are someone who cannot get vaccinated because you have an allergy or you're immunocompromised, and those are the types of people you have in your immediate home or your bubble or whatever, then you still have to practice additional caution because those people can still be infected. And so what we've seen with the vaccine is that it absolutely is really effective at stopping disease. Well, more so death, but then also disease. So you see a reduced rate of disease and then a reduced severity of disease. And we do see some reduction in infection and replication, but it's not 100%. And so it's possible that you as a vaccinated person, even though you might not get sick or you might not die of infection, you can still potentially pass that on to other folks. And so we're still waiting for more data on that. And that's kind of why we haven't gotten full approval for those vaccines yet, right? Because we haven't seen the full amount of data. And so if we do see that there's like a huge reduction in infection and then subsequent spread, then you can then relax those more, but we're still not sure. And so we're still saying to operate under a caution that you could be infected and not know. You could basically have an asymptomatic infection and still infect someone who has not been vaccinated fully.
And so building off that, one of our participants today shared that they had the opportunity to participate in one of the phase 1 trials and was early for vaccination, but they're concerned that there might be a decrease in efficacy at some point in time. Do you have any ideas about if or when a booster may be released for vaccines?
So I think the conversation around boosters is a little premature because we have seen that the vaccination has had pretty good coverage still, or protective coverage, in terms of the different mutation variants. But I'm assuming once there is a variant that reduces immunity so much to the point where people start to get concerned would be when they start to work on and release a booster. And so again, I mean, it's kind of hard to predict because we don't know what vaccine uptake is going to look like over the next couple of months, and then like how that's then going to affect whether or not the virus mutates. But I mean, because even now we're starting to see, right, like decrease. There was LA, I think, had no coronavirus, no COVID-19 deaths for like 2 or 3 days, and that's the first time since the pandemic started. And so we're starting to already see some changes even with the low level of people who have been vaccinated. And so yeah, I mean, it could be in the next year, it could be 5 years from now. It really just depends on what vaccine coverage and then like what that vaccine coverage does look like.
So can you comment on some of the recent studies that have found that people who were vaccinated and had suffered symptoms such as fatigue, fever, body aches after vaccination, either the first or second one, would have been more likely to be infected by the COVID-19 vaccine, or any knowledge around some of the symptoms that people are experiencing after they're vaccinated?
Yeah, to my knowledge, there's no correlation. That's not to say that there isn't. I just haven't seen any studies of those yet. If we think about all the other vaccines that we have gotten over time, people have reactions to the flu vaccine, people have reactions to the tetanus vaccine. And so it's a normal reaction. I don't know whether or not that relates to your susceptibility to the original pathogen pre-vaccination. I think it's just your body being like, hey, there's something funky going on here. Let's get at that before we have a problem. But if the person who it's a Haley, okay, yeah. So if you have papers that say that, I would love to see them, and then I can give you my opinion. I just haven't seen them.
Awesome, thank you. Do you think that we might need to get a COVID vaccine every year as we've done with the flu?
COVID and flu are a little different. Flu has a higher mutation rate. Flu has a different evolutionary mechanism where it can like exchange genetic segments when multiple flu viruses infect the same person. Coronaviruses do have a method of evolution called recombination, but so far we haven't seen any recombination or mutation that has like completely completely removed immunity. And so I mean, I definitely think it's possible we'll need a booster. I definitely think it's possible that we'll have to get more than one shot. I don't know that it will need it for every year. I don't think flu and SARS-2 are similar enough that would be necessary, but nothing is impossible. So
I think that's a great summary of the last year. Who knows? So if you had a choice between any of the vaccines that were currently available, so say that they were all available and you had a choice, which one would you pick?
I mean, if they're all available, I guess, I know this is hard for me to answer because I've already been vaccinated. Right. So, I mean, I've already gotten the Pfizer vaccine, but that was the only thing that was available when I went. I think J&J has the benefit of only being one shot versus two. So like if you have a phobia of needles, that might be where you go. I think I probably, yeah, I would have chosen. I don't know. I don't think I would have chosen. I don't, that's a hard question.
Totally fair. So one of the things that we're seeing pop up in a lot of the recent newscasts are people only getting the first shot of their vaccine and not the second one. Can you talk about some of the concerns that might exist if people don't complete the entire inoculation series?
Yeah, so there's been some concern that you can more effectively generate the escape mutants if you are not fully vaccinated. Though the data that we are getting for folks who even have just one vaccination is that it's not as likely as we were thinking prior to getting some of that data back. But ultimately, right, like if we're vaccinating people mostly so that we can start to prevent death and then start to prevent disease. And so if you don't get your full vaccination, it's possible that you can still get a severe form of disease. And so then you have, right, all of the potential repercussions and side effects of COVID infection. So like the long haulers who have migraines and all of the other kind of stuff. So we really need the full series to be completely protected from that. And while some folks who get the first injection are then like semi-protected against severe disease, you still could then potentially be spreading disease to other people as well. And so that's why if you are getting a vaccine that has 2 shots, you should get both shots. There's some debate about how much time you can go in between both shots. And so they've been tested to do either 3 weeks for Pfizer or 4 weeks for Moderna in between the second shot. Some science has shown that you can go as far as like 2 months. And so it's not necessarily an issue yet for people who haven't gotten their follow-up vaccine, but hopefully the people who haven't gotten their second shot yet are going to then like reschedule and we'll keep things going in terms of herd immunity and whatnot. So,
what healthcare practices do you think will remain post-COVID?
Can you give me a little bit more detail for what you're thinking in terms of that? Like healthcare, what do you mean like health? Oh, yeah. I think most people who already don't have an issue with masks are probably likely to continue. I know people who are like having kids or having babies soon, and they're like, we're definitely still going to have like guests wear masks when their babies come over, that sort of thing. I think the last year has been really good in showing us that if you wear masks and you continue to wash your hands, that you can do things like basically reduce the flu down to 0. And so I think for folks who are interested in not being sick might continue those practices. I mean, even I have a 2-year-old who goes to daycare, and because all of his teachers have been wearing masks, he has not been sick in over a year and a half, like, which the winter before COVID became a pandemic, the whole house was sick like every 2 weeks because of daycare. And so that's been like really great. And so I think that it'll stick around in some capacity, maybe not like everybody wearing them, but I think specifically people who especially are concerned will probably keep it going.
So our last question before we conclude today is we were wondering if you might be able to share a little bit with us and our participants about your work with the Black Microbiologists Association, and even how you ended up getting to this point where you were doing this type of research and this type of work, which ended up being very timely this past year. And so if you could share a little bit about your story with us so people can see kind of where you might take your experiences in the future.
Yeah, so I mean, I think even pre-pandemic, so I'll start with my husband is an engineer, and so he has been a member of the National Society for Black Engineers for years. And so I had always been like, well, we don't have anything like that for microbiology, and I've always been really interested in microbiology. So in the back of my head, it's always been something I've been interested in, but didn't feel like I had the bandwidth to start, or like it just felt like a really big project to do. And then the pandemic hit, and we were seeing, right, this disproportionate impact on Black communities and other minority communities, so Latinx, Native American. And I was just like, well, duh, because it's basically reproducing all of these structural inequalities that already exist in society. And then on top of that, we then had all of the Black Lives Matter protests over the summer. And so it was really the first time within like the academic space or the research space that we started to be able to talk about racism in any like significant way. And so a bunch of other scientists from different fields had kind of gotten together and started these like Black in specific scientific discipline week. And I was like, oh, we're definitely going to do one for virology. But there are not as many Black virologists as there are like microbiologists as a whole. And so we then like expanded it out to Black microbiologists, Black in Microbiology Week. And so we planned this really big online program, and you can, I'll get to the slides in a minute, but you can go to our website, and then we also have like the YouTube videos of all the panels we held. And basically and we had like contacted different academic departments for and companies for sponsorship and that kind of stuff. We basically understood that there seemed to be this missing piece, this like the conduit between Black microbiologists and then like academia or industry in terms of people who could advocate for Black microbiologists and then connect us to each other, because we seem to be very scattered and there's never like an abundance of us in number in any one place. And so we were like, well, I guess this is kind of bigger than just Black and Micro Week. So maybe we need to go ahead and like make this an actual organization. And so that's kind of how Black Microbiologists Association was born. And so we have been working on our mission over the last couple of months. And so our mission basically is to provide career and professional support and development, outreach to our communities, provide scientific communication, and then advocate on behalf of our members to larger scientific societies and academia and industry as a whole. And so that's kind of what we're looking forward to doing. And so for those who are interested in or interested in learning more about Black Microbiologists Association, we have a website, so you can go to blackandmicrobiology.org. We also have a Twitter, which is at Black and Micro. And then we have an email address. And then if you're already interested in membership, or should you, we have a link on the website too, if you do some research and decide that you want to be a member. But this is the info for if you wanted to register as a member to be a Black Microbiologist Association. But ultimately it comes down to, I've always been really interested in advocating for people who look like me in the sciences, because we don't exist in such a large number. And some of us have gone through some really not great experiences. And so if I can make it better for those who are coming behind me, then that's what I want to do.
And as a follow-up, as you were talking, that came in, Dr. Taylor, are some of our attendees want to know how they can connect with you after this presentation? Could you drop potentially some links or even your LinkedIn?
I got you. Give me 1 second, but I can do that. I'll stop sharing so then I can actually open my windows. But yeah, I will drop. Okay, so I can give you my email. So give that to you really quick. I will give you my LinkedIn with a caveat that I don't check it very often. And so if you don't get a message from me immediately, don't take it personally. I just probably haven't checked it recently. I think this will work. And then I'll give you my Twitter. That's my Twitter handle. Oh, and my website.
Thank you so much. And I would share that Dr. Taylor's Twitter has been fantastic in getting like the live updates as the pandemic has went on with some of the information and dispelling it. So a great opportunity to kind of follow and get updated information, as we know it comes frequently as we are learning more or seeing some of these things like the mutations and some of the process going through with the vaccination. So I would strongly recommend that. I'm going to turn it over to Haley to kind of wrap us up for the day.
So on behalf of Westchester University, thank you, Dr. Taylor, for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today. I hope that each person who has joined the presentation has learned something new about COVID-19 that you can pass on to somebody else. This recording will be made available on the Office of Wellness Promotion's YouTube page. You can find it by searching WCU Wellness Promotion. And it'll be on the website as well within the week. All participants will receive a feedback survey after the presentation today, and your feedback is so important to us. Thank you all for attending and have a great day.
Bye, everyone.